narrow, sunken below the level of the surrounding fields, flanked on both sides by hedgerows so thick and old they had become walls of earth and root. It offered almost no room to manoeuvre, and almost perfect concealment for anything willing to wait. The morning was grey and damp, the kind of Norman morning that made metal sweat and engines run cold. And in the shadow of one of those hedgerows, something was waiting. It was low, lower than a tank had any right to be. Its gun, and this was the thing that made you look twice, pointed the wrong way. Not forward, toward the enemy. Backward, toward the rear of the vehicle, over the engine deck, aimed at the lane behind it. A long, angular barrel pointing in the direction a sensible weapon should never point. And then, something moved in the lane. The crew inside the waiting vehicle heard it before they saw it. Tracks on wet road. The particular sound of something heavy coming around a bend. There was a pause. The specific kind of pause that contains a decision, and then the gun fired. The lane went quiet again. And the vehicle that had fired was already moving. Not reversing, not turning around. Moving forward. Driving away from the shot in the direction its gun already pointed. Gone before the smoke had cleared. Gone before anyone on the other side had time to work out where the shot had come from. This was the Archer. And what looked like a design mistake was, in the right hands, on the right ground, close to genius. The Archer, officially designated the SP-17 PDR Valentine Archer, is one of the more unusual-looking weapons of the Second World War. A long, powerful anti-tank gun mounted on a small, aging chassis, pointing backward over the engine, crewed by men who had to think about geometry and escape routes before they thought about firepower. It was mocked, it was questioned, it was called a compromise, a stopgap, a vehicle born from necessity rather than design ambition. And yet, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the Rhine crossings of 1945, the Archer did its job with a quiet lethality that outlasted every criticism. It was not the most powerful or the most glamorous of the anti-tank solutions the Allies fielded in the late war, but it solved a specific problem so efficiently, so cleverly, that in its assigned role, it was difficult to improve upon. To understand the Archer, you have to understand the problem it was built to solve, and that problem was not really about the vehicle at all. It was about the gun. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most capable weapons of its kind in the Allied arsenal by 1944. It could defeat the armour of the most dangerous German tanks at combat ranges that gave crews a genuine fighting chance. Against the vehicles that had made German armoured formations so formidable, the Panthers, the heavy tanks, the well-armoured assault guns, the 17-pounder, was the British Army's most reliable answer. The problem was getting it to the right place at the right time. A towed 17-pounder required a towing vehicle, a crew that had to unhitch and set up under pressure, a position that could be approached and prepared before the engagement began. Towed guns were powerful and accurate and had given enormous service. But they were also vulnerable in the moments between travel and readiness, limited in their ability to react to sudden threats, and dependent on the kind of deliberate, prepared positioning that a fast-moving or fluid battle did not always allow. The British Army needed a version of the 17-pounder that could move under its own power, respond to changing situations, provide anti-tank protection during advances as well as in defensive operations, and critically survive in the kind of mobile, chaotic battle that the European theatre was increasingly demanding. The question was how to put that gun on a tracked chassis without creating something so large, so heavy, or so complex that it introduced new problems to replace the old ones. The answer involved making choices, uncomfortable choices, choices that produced a vehicle that looked, to the casual observer, quite wrong. The first choice was the chassis. The Valentine tank, an earlier British design that had served with some distinction in the Desert War, was, by 1943, approaching the end of its useful life as a gun tank. It was small, relatively low to the ground, and had a production line that was still operating. It was also, by that point, well understood mechanically, and while no piece of wartime equipment was without its faults, the Valentine had accumulated enough service time that its engineers and crews knew what to expect from it. Using the Valentine chassis as the basis for the Archer was, in essence, a form of productive recycling. The basic automotive components were proven. The hull provided a low starting point. The production infrastructure already existed. An entirely new chassis would have taken time and resources that the development schedule could not afford. But the Valentine chassis was not large, and the 17-pounder was very long, a high-velocity gun that derived its effectiveness precisely from the barrel length and the propellant charge that the length allowed. Getting the 17-pounder onto the Valentine meant solving a geometry problem, and the solution that the designers arrived at was the one that made everyone look twice. Point the gun backward. The logic of the rear-facing mount deserves careful explanation, because it sounds counterintuitive right up until the moment you understand it, and then it becomes obvious. The problem with fitting a long gun onto a small chassis in the conventional way pointing forward is recoil. A high-velocity anti-tank gun generates enormous force when it fires, and that force travels back through the gun, mounting into whatever is holding it. On a large vehicle with a properly designed turret ring and a substantial hull, this can be managed. On a small, compact chassis, the forces involved risk damaging the vehicle or making accurate repeated fire impossible. Pointing the gun backward over the engine deck solved this in several ways. The recoil could travel into the rear of the vehicle's superstructure in a direction that the hull was better positioned to absorb. The gun's breech, which had to be accessible to the crew for loading, could be positioned within reach without requiring a full rotating turret that the Valentine chassis could not support. And the overall length of the vehicle remained manageable, the gun barrel extended behind the vehicle, where there was room for it, rather than in front, where it would have created handling and visibility problems. The result was a vehicle with a genuinely low profile, difficult to see from a distance, easy to conceal in vegetation or behind terrain features, and a gun that could engage targets to the rear of the vehicle's travel direction. The limitations were real and significant. The Archer could not traverse its gun far to either side, which meant the vehicle itself had to be positioned to point the gun approximately toward the expected threat. Engaging a target that appeared from an unexpected direction required moving the entire vehicle, which took time and revealed position. The crew had limited overhead protection, which exposed them to artillery fragments and small arms fire from above. These were not minor constraints. They defined how the Archer could and could not be used. But the tactical advantage of the layout, the feature that transformed these constraints from a design flaw into a design decision, was what happened immediately after the gun fired. When an Archer fired its 17-pounder, the vehicle did not need to reverse to withdraw from its firing position. It was already pointing in the direction it needed to travel. The crew could engage a target, lower the gun barrel to the travel position, and drive forward away from the shot, away from the return fire, deeper into the cover they had emerged from without performing any of the slow, awkward, loud maneuvers that reversing a tracked vehicle under fire required. This was not a trivial advantage. Consider what reversing under fire actually involves. A tracked vehicle reversing is slower than one moving forward. The driver has reduced visibility to the rear. The engine noise changes in ways that are audible to observers nearby. The vehicle's profile is presented to the threat for longer. And the time required to reverse a meaningful distance to actually remove the vehicle from the immediate engagement area is considerably longer than the time required to drive forward the same distance. The Archer, by pointing its gun backward, had effectively pre-solved the withdrawal problem. The engagement sequence was move into position, facing away from the expected threat. Wait, engage, drive forward. The entire sequence could be completed faster than almost any other self-propelled anti-tank solution available. For a weapon whose survival depended on not being in the same place twice, this was close to optimal. The crews who operated Archers developed a tactical vocabulary built around this capability. Position selection was everything, not just where is a good place to shoot from, but where is a good place to shoot from that also has a clear, fast exit. The hedgerow lanes of Normandy, which had been a nightmare for conventional armour, were almost ideally suited to the Archer's requirements. A vehicle that could disappear into a sunken lane after firing and be gone before the dust settled was a vehicle that could survive in an environment defined by close range, short sight lines and sudden contact. If you're following this story, the engineering logic that turns a backwards gun into a battlefield advantage and finding it interesting, consider subscribing. There is more to come on the vehicles, weapons, and doctrines that shaped the final years of the Second World War. The Archer entered operational service in 1944, and was deployed to anti-tank regiments supporting British and Commonwealth formations in northwest Europe. To appreciate where the Archer fitted in the broader anti-tank picture, it helps to look briefly at the alternatives. The towed 7-pounder was powerful and accurate, but its limitations in fluid combat have already been described. The M10 Achilles, an American-built tank destroyer fitted with the 7-pounder by British Ordnance, was a capable vehicle but taller, heavier, and with an open-topped turret that offered crew protection without the specific tactical nimbleness of the Archer's layout. The Sherman Firefly, a standard Sherman tank fitted with a 7-pounder in a modified turret, was a more conventional fighting vehicle, better suited to combined arms operations and more flexible in engagement, but also more visible, more expensive to produce, and without the Archer's specific shoot-and-scoot advantage. Each of these represented a different answer to the same underlying question. How do you give infantry formations the anti-tank protection they need in a war that has become dominated by armour? The Archer's answer was the most specialised of the group. It was not intended to replace any of the others. It was intended to fill a particular niche: concealed, mobile ambush capability, rapidly deployable, quickly repositionable, that the others did not fill as efficiently. The Archer was a specialist tool. Its value depended entirely on being used as one. Let us follow a crew through an engagement that captures what the Archer was designed to do. The accounts from crews who served on Archers in northwest Europe, though dispersed across unit histories and veterans' testimonies, share a consistent shape. The crew has identified a position the previous evening, a gap in a hedgerow along a lane that reconnaissance suggests enemy armour may use. They have moved into position before first light, when engine noise and movement are harder to attribute. The Archer sits with its gun pointing back down the lane, its low profile almost level with the surrounding vegetation. The crew has covered the vehicle with cut branches and netting. To anyone looking from the lane junction 50 yards away, there is nothing there, only hedgerow. Then the sound begins. Tracks, the particular rhythm of a tracked vehicle moving at cautious speed. The engine note that says moving, not idling. The crew does not move. The commander watches through his optics. A vehicle appears at the junction, the calculation of threat, range, angle, all compressed into a few seconds. The shot goes. The 7-pounder is not subtle, it is loud, and the muzzle flash is significant, and anyone within several hundred meters will know something has fired. But the Archer is already moving. The driver engages, the vehicle rolls forward into the gap behind them, and within seconds they are no longer where they were. The smoke hangs in the hedgerow opening. The source of the shot is already 50 yards away and invisible. What the enemy experiences in that moment accounts from German units encountered by anti-tank ambushes during this period, describe a specific disorientation, is a shot that seems to come from a vehicle that then immediately retreats without turning. The visual logic of a tank retreating involves watching it turn, watching its rear become its front, watching the movement that betrays direction and speed. The Archer's withdrawal did not look like that. It looked like a vehicle driving away from you, which, from the perspective of someone who had just been engaged, was precisely what it was doing, but in the direction that made no sense if you assumed a conventional forward-facing gun. The confusion bought time, and in an ambush, time is the difference between repositioning successfully and being destroyed in your firing position by return fire or by the tank crew's companion vehicles. The second human dimension of the Archer's story belongs to the infantry who operated in the same areas. The late war battle in northwest Europe was not purely offensive. Even during the general Allied advance, the front line had flanks, and flanks had to be covered against counterattacks. German armoured counterattacks were a persistent tactical feature of the campaign local, sudden, aimed at recovering ground or disrupting Allied logistics at critical moments. For infantry units holding positions on the edge of an advance, the knowledge that somewhere in the trees or the sunken lane behind them there was an Archer covering the approach road provided a specific kind of reassurance that other weapons did not quite replicate. A towed gun required setup time that a sudden counterattack might not allow. A tank in Overwatch was a more obvious target and a more expensive asset to deploy. The Archer, sitting concealed in a position it had occupied silently before the infantry moved up, ready to fire and immediately withdraw if the situation changed, was a stopgap that required almost no management from the infantry it protected. It was simply there, covering the gap, available if needed, invisible if not. Infantry accounts from this period occasionally describe the discovery, sometimes days after the fact, that a vehicle had been sitting in concealment nearby throughout an engagement, that shots had been fired from a direction they had not identified as occupied, and that the vehicle responsible had subsequently relocated without ever being seen. The Archer was not glamorous in the way that a Firefly charging into an engagement might be glamorous. It was useful in the quieter, more deliberate way that determined the texture of the campaign's middle distances. Production of the Archer was significant but not enormous, reflecting its specialist role. The vehicle entered service late enough in the war that its operational record was concentrated in a relatively compressed timeframe. It served with British and Commonwealth anti-tank units through the campaigns in northwest Europe and continued in service with some armies into the post-war period, a quiet indicator that the design, for all its eccentricities, had proven durable and effective enough to outlast the conflict that had created it. The longevity was not accidental. A vehicle that was cheap to operate, mechanically manageable from a proven chassis, and capable of performing its specific function reliably tended to remain in service. The Archer was not glamorous enough to attract the kind of attention that led to early retirement. It simply continued to do its job wherever someone needed a mobile, concealable 17-pounder and had the operational patience to use one correctly. Numbers for specific engagements and kill tallies are not something that can be stated with confidence, and it would misrepresent the Archer's story to dress it in statistics that the records do not reliably support. What the records do support is the consistent assessment of those who used it, that in its proper role, it was a vehicle whose apparent awkwardness dissolved the moment you understood what it was for. And this is where the Archer's story converges with a broader truth about military design that the Second World War demonstrated repeatedly. The instinct, when looking at an unusual piece of equipment, is to measure it against some universal standard to ask whether it is better or worse than the conventional solution. A gun pointing backward fails that test immediately. It is obviously inferior to a gun pointing forward, if pointing forward is the only frame of reference you allow. It cannot engage targets in front of the vehicle at short notice. It requires the entire vehicle to be oriented before the gun is useful. It looks wrong. But the universal standard is a fiction. There is no single measure that determines the worth of a weapon system across all contexts and all roles. There is only the question of whether a particular tool does a particular job better than the alternatives available at the time and place it is needed. The Archer did not need to engage targets in front of it. It needed to engage targets from concealment, to fire once or twice with devastating accuracy, and to disappear before the return fire arrived. For that job, that specific, narrow, carefully defined job, the backward gun was not a mistake. It was the answer. The gun that pointed the wrong way pointed exactly right at the problem it was built to solve. The vehicle that looked like a compromise was, in the hedgerows and the sunken lanes and the approach roads of northwest Europe, precisely the compromise the situation required. Not every weapon has to be perfect. Some weapons only have to be correct, and the Archer, in its moment and in its place, was exactly that. That, in the end, is enough.